But today, I want to talk to you about the future is awesome and what we can do about it. Ben, can I get the volume turned down just a little bit? I'm getting a lot of feedback to me here. Yeah, awesome. And people up the back, if you want to come down, you're very, very welcome to come down because you're amazing people. We love you. So when I grew up as a child, I spent a lot of time watching spy movies. And I really like the spy movies not because of the espionage or the spies or like all of those sorts of things. I loved them for the technology. And there were all these cool things I saw in spy movies that I wanted to own and play with. So you had things like this. This is a cigarette that was also a rocket launcher. So completely realistic. Obviously, that's something which we have today. This is a car, which is also a submarine, which is very, very cool. Again, something we have today. But what I wanted more than anything else in the world was this device here, which is a digital watch that is also a label maker. And you can imagine as an 8-year-old, that is the coolest thing you could possibly imagine. And of course, I thought all this technology would exist, if not now, some point in the future, except for one thing. And that was a car which knew its location and the streets around it and how fast it was going, all these things. And how would the car know that? Like, how would the car know, like, what the streets are around it? That's impossible. That would never happen in my lifetime. But as we know, we all have these little pocket computers now, and you don't even need an entire car. You simply have a pocket computer that knows where you are in the streets around you. And so the thing which I've learned from this is that the future arrives very, very quickly. The future arrives much more quickly than we expect. And that's a bit of a problem for me, because if I want to talk about in vitro meat, for example, which is grown in a laboratory rather than in a farm, if I want to talk about a future where 3D printed body parts are a $500 million a year industry, if I want to talk to people about, what it might be like for a machine to truly experience what it's like to go to Burning Man, then people keep telling me that's impossible. That would never happen in my lifespan. And the fact that they tell me these things, that's unrealistic, that's not in my lifespan, I can understand why. A lot of these technologies are very, very scary to people. This idea of in vitro meat, people don't know how to feel about that. And all these other things we're seeing getting developed. People are like, oh, I don't know how I feel. And in fact, these future technologies often appear in films in a very, very scary way. And so whilst it's not useful to simply not think about it, that's what people tend to do. As a result, we tend to go from saying that's impossible to there's an app for that. And I don't know if anyone here has been playing with Prisma recently. It's a phone app where you can take a selfie and then it does a style transform, so it can be like a great artist painted it. Here is your Van Gogh version of you and everything. It's using all the stuff which was like completely experimental like a year ago. And now you've got an app for it that you can do like these amazing style transforms with pictures in an app. I was involved with a very simple computer game recently where they didn't have a graphic artist, so they just took pictures of what they wanted and they did style transforms using machine intelligence. It was absolutely fascinating. So I want to show you a little trick that I've learned, which lets you go from telling people, oh, what about these technologies, and them feeling uncomfortable, to having really good conversations. And the trick is that you say, hey, think about what it might be like 1,000 years in the future. Or think what it'd be like in 10,000 years in the future. So imagine all the technological progress you've seen over the last 20 years or the last 50 years. Microwaves are commonplace now, and 50 years ago they didn't exist, and we all have pocket computers, and all of these amazing things. Imagine that technology brought forward 10,000 years and what it might be like. And then imagine that you've got this future where you've got children who are 3D printing body parts, like 3D printing prosthetic limbs as a camp activity. Or think about a situation where in vitro meat is affordable to the average consumer. Or think about this future where you have like advanced virtual reality gaming rigs in the comfort of your own lounge room. And people go, oh, we're not talking about like existing technology, we're doing a thought experiment. And because it's 10,000 years in the future, we can talk about how things should be or shouldn't be, but it's something which will never, ever, ever affect me. We're definitely not making a decision. We're definitely not talking about anything that already exists. And this is the purpose of sci-fi. A lot of the reasons why I love science fiction so much is it's to talk about how things might be like in the far future, in this purpose, like looking at things as fiction, when often they are real technologies which exist today. So obviously, I'm not going to talk about any real technologies in this talk. They're all going to be future technologies. But I want you to sort of imagine 10,000 years in the future where we have autonomous vehicles. So cars which can drive themselves. And I know this is really hard to believe that these might possibly exist because it's such a foreign and weird idea, but it's 10,000 years in the future they do. And I want to give you a thought experiment. So imagine that you are a passenger in one of these vehicles. So there's no more drivers anymore, there are no steering wheels. You're a passenger in one of these vehicles. And it's driving down this tiny little sort of one-lane road that's cut out of a cliff face. And you're there, you know, playing Candy Crush or reading about the census failures or whatever it happens to be that you're doing in the car. And quite unexpectedly, a child runs out into the middle of the road, chasing a ball and trips over. And the child was not carrying their personal tracking device, so your computer didn't anticipate them being there, and they were like, you know, hiding around a corner so that you didn't get a visual on them. You can't avoid getting a fatal collision in this example. So the car, if it hits the child, will kill the child. But the car has an option. The car can choose to drive itself off the cliff. So this is not something where the passenger has any say. This is going to be the car's programming. It can sacrifice itself and its passenger to save that child. Now my question for you is, should it do so? And some of you might say yes, and some of you might say no. And if your answer is no, then what happens if there's 2 children in front of the car? Or what happens if there's 5 children in front of the car? And if you're wondering, how does the car know it's 10,000 years in the future? The car can count how many children are in front of it. And I hope at some point you will say the car should sacrifice itself and its passenger to save a sufficiently large number of children. I seriously hope that you will say that. And this brings us into this realm of machine ethics, of how do we build machines which act in an ethical manner, and what does that mean? Because it turns out agreeing on that is very, very hard, but it's something which we should be talking about before this technology matures. The more interesting question I have is, regardless of whether or not you think that it should swerve off the cliff for 1 child or 5 children or 1 million children, the more interesting question for me, would you buy one? Would you buy a vehicle which you knew would sacrifice you if it felt it was for the good of humanity? And even if you would buy that vehicle, do you conceivably think there is someone out there who would not buy that vehicle? I cannot hear a word you're saying up the back there, so I may have to ask for questions at the end. What was that? Free software? That'd be great, because then you can modify your car to run over all the children. That'd be a fantastic idea. And this is the point. There is almost certainly a market for unethical vehicles. It may not be blatantly there, but there will be vehicles where it's like, hey, you know what? This car will it doesn't matter how many children we have to kill, we will get you to your destination on time. And that worries me. That is not a good future for humanity. It might be a good future if you're inside an autonomous vehicle. It's a terrible future, or you're inside that autonomous vehicle. It's a terrible future for everyone else. So that's one thing which I'd like us to think about. The other one is a variant of that problem. So imagine the same situation. You're in this autonomous vehicle. It's driving along the cliff. You have the child that runs out in front. But now we've got a twist on the scenario. Rather than it being a fatal collision, if the car continues on the road, the car can now stop safely. So the child is out on the road, the car sees the child, the car can stop, and the child is going to be fine, and you're going to be fine, and everyone else behind you is going to be fine. My question for you here, how many people need to be inconvenienced because there are people behind you on the road? How many people need to be inconvenienced before you can justify killing that child? so you can get to your destination faster and the people behind you can get to your destination faster or their destinations faster. Now, I hope your reaction to this is like, what an awful question. Like, why would you even ask that, Paul? And the reason I'm asking this is because it's one of the few things we have an answer to. And you might be, how do we get an answer to that? What is the answer? It's 8 million people. If there's more than 8 million people behind you, we consider it to be tolerable to kill a person. And the reason I can say that is because in the United States, which is the figures I'm using here, for every 8 million trips that people take by car, somebody dies. We have a traffic fatality. And we still allow humans to drive cars. So we consider this figure to be tolerable when it comes to traffic fatalities for the convenience of getting around by car. Now, I hope that autonomous vehicles can do much, much better than this. But this at least has an answer of what we're willing to tolerate. The one thing we can't do is we can't say that nobody should die. Because if you have an autonomous vehicle and you say you're never allowed to harm anyone, you can never have a risk of somebody dying or getting hurt, you have an autonomous vehicle that tries to drive around at 3 kilometers an hour. Because maybe there's somebody hiding in the bushes in camouflage gear around a blind corner who's waiting to jump out under that car, and the car can't allow that to happen. So if you say nobody should ever die, your cars become useless as vehicles, and nobody would ever use them. So people will die with autonomous vehicles. We need to have meaningful discussions as to how many people will die and what will be the circumstances around that. And they're uncomfortable discussions to have. People shy away from them. But think 10,000 years in the future and what it might be like. The other thing which is interesting here, again, I'm using US figures here. We have 40,000 fatalities every year in the United States due to road accidents. And we can do better. Absolutely, we can do better. I think that in your 10,000-year future, you might have a situation where there's virtually no deaths because autonomous vehicles have much better reaction times. They can talk to each other to share information about road hazards. They can make sure they're properly spaced. They're not checking their phone. They're not like checking on Facebook and everything. We could have virtually no deaths with autonomous vehicles. But imagine the situation where there's a software bug. And that software bug affects 2,000 people, and they all die in one day. You can imagine the headlines from that. You can imagine the amount of fear that people would experience from these killer cars, which are out to murder people for whatever reason. It might be a benign software bug. What terrifies me is the idea of a zero-day exploit where you have hackers who have been able to compromise these cars and then can use them for assassination or for terrorism or for like playing Rick Astley songs really loud as you go down the highway. Like all of those things are scary possibilities. But what you have with something like this is an arguably a better future. We're seeing 95% less people die if you have one of these each year, but you see an enormous concentration of liability. So if you are an autonomous vehicle manufacturer, rather than it being 40,000 people roughly responsible for 40,000 people dying, you have one entity, the car manufacturer, responsible for 2,000 people dying. And that's a big risk to take. Is actually an enormous barrier to the entry of the autonomous vehicle market, because if something goes wrong, you are absolutely screwed when it comes to liability. So there's interesting questions as to how do we get around this. Obviously, doing a better job with technology is great. Grab me afterwards, I'll talk to you about hacking Jeeps. There's this amazing hack where you can remote control Jeeps on the highway using the cellular phone network. So examples where we're not even at autonomous vehicles and you can do these sorts of things. But there are these questions of how do we get around this concentration of liability? One might be a legislative change. Obviously here in Australia, when you have a car insurance, there's also like mandatory third-party insurance. There may also be something where you have like a mandatory robot car insurance that gets paid to the government, and then if you have a sort of a bug that occurs and there's no negligence which happens with that, you can pay out of that fund. That would be one possibility. You might see insurance companies being happy to sort of take on this changed risk because cars are going to be so much safer. They might say, okay, we'll charge you like, only 25% the cost of a human driving that car, even though the risk might be only like 1% of the human driving the car. You might find insurance agencies are like totally on board with this. But what I think we're most likely to see is not widespread private ownership of autonomous vehicles. I think we'll see, except for things like status symbols, I think we'll see almost entirely corporate ownership of autonomous vehicles. And we've already seen this in science fiction. Some of you might remember Johnny Cab from Total Recall. Hopefully we'll have better user interfaces than Johnny Cab, and Kathy will be talking about that next. But the reason why I think we'll be seeing this is because of headlines like this. Uber CEO to Tesla, please sell me 500,000 autonomous electric cars in 2020. That's not even that far away. That's really, really close. Why would Uber do this? Because the most expensive cost of driving people around are the human drivers. And so Uber stands to make oodles of money if they get rid of the human drivers. And it makes sense to do this. You can drive the car much more often. You don't need to have them sleep or anything. They'll occasionally go back and recharge. This makes perfect sense for Uber to be doing. And what's interesting is Tesla said no. Tesla said no to that request. But this sort of highlights one thing, which is that if you are a taxi driver, and in the United States there's 230,000 taxi drivers, you're probably not going to have a job for very much longer. And by taxi driver, I mean Uber driver, taxi driver, personal driver of that sort. Now that seems like a lot of people to be out of a job. It's almost nothing compared to the number of truck drivers that we have in the United States, which is 3.5 million. And as the census will tell us when they get it back online, we have a similarly large number of truck drivers in Australia. Perhaps not 3.5 million, but certainly an overrepresentation for our population. Now, this will actually happen. I believe this will actually happen first. Before we see autonomous taxis, which, let's face it, they're really hard. You've got inner suburban conditions, you've got people jaywalking all the time. It's absolutely really hard stuff to do on the roads. Trucks simply need to be on the highway and matching traffic and driving in a straight line for 18 hours a day, or however long the autonomous truck can drive for between recharges. So this is something which autonomous trucks do very, very well. It's something they're already doing in Europe as well. There are autonomous trucks in Europe, and they actually get together in convoys and they slipstream each other. So they have better fuel efficiency than human drivers as well. But when you have something like this happening, 3.5 million truck drivers are out of work, we have what's known as technological unemployment, where technology is replacing humans. And this is not just the truck drivers that are out of work. These are your motels that are out of work. These are your food stops which are out of work. These are your entertainment which is out of work. These are even your meth dealers who are out of work, because truckies consume a huge amount of meth. So this is going to change the economy, both the sort of below board economy and the above board economy. They all have guns as well. Also, all the truck drivers have guns. Everyone involved in this has a gun if you're in the United States. So what could go wrong? Now, when I talk about technological unemployment, people tell me, oh, Paul, this has happened so many times before, and whenever new technologies come about, they always create more jobs than you lose. And that's a really interesting attitude to have. It's a very reassuring attitude to have, because then you don't have to worry about widespread unemployment. But is it actually a legitimate claim? So let's look at the last time this happened en masse, Industrial Revolution. So back in the late 1800s, we had a widespread replacement of human labor with machine labor. And in fact, it was so scary. If you were a manual laborer, it was absolutely terrifying because these machines were taking your jobs. And you had instances of tailors that would break into factories literally with pitchforks and flaming torches and burn them to the ground because the machines were coming for their jobs. And this became such an enormous problem with destruction of machines that in England in 1812, the Destruction of Stocking Frames Act was passed. And it made it a capital offence to harm a robot, or through an action, allow a robot to come to harm. Now the fact that that was a capital offence shows you just how terrified people were that machines would take their jobs. But as we know, we still have tailors. And in fact, tailors are more efficient now because they have machines to help them. But there are entire classes of workers that no longer exist anymore. And we don't talk about them because they've completely disappeared from our memory. So this is one of my favorites. This is a water bearer. So back before we had plumbing, you would have cisterns in your house, and you'd have a water bearer who would bring water to your house and fill them up, and you would pay them. So it's kind of like Uber for water, I guess. And what was really interesting is you can find these startup guides. It's like how to start your business as a water bearer. And they talk about how do you do your branding, and how do you do outreach, and how do you pivot to like different industries, and all of these other sorts of things. This was a legitimate startup industry. And it's been completely obsoleted by plumbing. And if you were a water bearer, sure, your job didn't exist anymore. Plumbers now exist, but you didn't have transferable skills. And it's the same thing with truck drivers. If you were a truck driver, you probably don't have skills which allow you to program robot trucks. So that is something where, there may be jobs being created, but the people losing jobs don't have access to them. In fact, this is what I do for a lot of my job. A lot of my work has been this sort of thing. Usually it's not shell scripts anymore. But there are a lot of people whose essentially their entire roles have been replaced by me writing some code. And it's usually not all that much code. So how do we handle this? How do we deal with technological unemployment? And we're seeing this not just with manual labor now, we're seeing this much, much more with white-collar labor as well. We're seeing this with things like bankers, looking at stock market prices. You have machines doing a better job at that. Well, one thing which I feel we absolutely need is affordable and accessible access to education. That is absolutely key, because if you have people losing jobs in one industry and they want to reskill, you have to have education there. So anything which is a barrier to that, be it making it more difficult to access education, usually it's money. If your education is very, very expensive, that is not going to be a good thing for your future going forward. The other thing is this whole idea of people not being completely put out of jobs in the long term because new jobs have been created. And if you look at the Industrial Revolution, you actually find that we're working less. It wasn't a case of, oh, there are new jobs for everyone. It's simply a case that we were working less with the jobs which were around. And you can see this quite markedly. The average work week in Western Europe in 1830s was about 70 hours a week. And in sort of modern days, it's about 40 hours a week. And this is a really interesting figure because there's been a lot of resistance to going below that, even though we potentially could. The other thing which I find interesting is leisure time. Over the same period, we've seen a dramatic increase in leisure time. So in the 1880s, we had about 44,000 hours of leisure per lifetime. In modern days, we see that coming up to around 120, 130,000 mark. That's a lot of leisure time. So what do people do with leisure time? Well, one thing I've discovered, it doesn't matter how far back you go through history, if you give people leisure time, there is one thing that they will do with it, and that's this: pictures of cats. And we can absolutely see this. You go back to like ancient Egypt, there are pictures of cats, and you go through like medieval manuscripts and there are pictures. WellPoint was known in 2010 for treating their patients with cancer very, very badly. And they would target them for what was known as rescission. So rescission is where you say, oh, look, I know that you've got an insurance with us and everything, you've got this insurance document, but you said that you disclosed all of your medical history. And we've now discovered that when you were 6 years old, you broke your ankle, and you never told us that. So actually, your insurance is invalid, and we can't pay for all of your treatment. And they just dropped them from the plan. And this was such an enormous deal that it actually reached presidential attention in the United States. And you have Obama on record saying, you are being absolutely evil with what you're doing here. You have to stop it. So there's this amazing sort of drama that went on with WellPoint trying to drop their cancer patients and the US government and the US president saying what you're doing is evil. So we now have a situation where the best cancer diagnostician on the planet is employed by the company or a company that has a very, very bad history of treating its cancer patients. And so I want to ask you, is Watson being used for the most good? And I can't say that Watson is not being used for the most good, but I'm sure you can understand how I could have a reasonable doubt there. That I might say, hey, there might be another future out there which is better than the one that we're in. There might be a different possibility out there where Watson is being used for the most good for humanity. Now, of course, everything which I've shown you here has been a real technology. Despite the fact that I said everything's 10,000 years in the future, everything I've shown you exists today. But I think that it really helps to think about them in terms of the future. And I certainly want you to think about things in terms of the future, because it means you can have these discussions about what would a society look like in 10,000 years' time where this is being used for the most good. And if you're working with technology, if you're working with policy, if you're able to influence people's minds, and you can all do that because you all interact with other people, you can ask, is this tech going to be used for the best causes? And if not, what do you do about it? Do you change the technology? Do you change society? Or is there something else which needs to change to try and reach that better future? Because I can assure you all that the future will be awesome, but only if we engineer it to be so. Everybody, thank you very much.